right, if you take your Bibles, please, and turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to be going through verse 16 through 24 this morning of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 16 through 24. You know, you go back to 2020, which honestly wasn't that long ago, when we were still trying to figure out the whole coronavirus thing and learning to say COVID-19, coronavirus and all that. The world was starting to shut down. And all of a sudden, we started hearing these things coming out, these PPP loans, right? Paycheck Protection Program. And just to help businesses pay their employees and get something out of there and trying to help people out. And it was designed, of course, to help people. The problem was some people were helping themselves with those. And the Edwards family happened to be one of those. They had lived a large portion of their lives in Canada and then moved over to Turkey, actually, as missionaries and spent quite a bit of time there. And for whatever reason, it doesn't say, but they came back in 2019. So before like COVID and all that stuff happened, then they settled down in Florida, and they had this ministry of that they had going on down there. But of course, they were affected like all the rest of us were affected when COVID hit and whatnot. But they decided they wanted to apply for these Paycheck Protection Program loans. And so they filled out the paperwork, and they filled it out, and they claimed, you know, they had 486 employees and $2.7 million of payroll per month. The reality was a little different. They had 4 employees, mom, dad, son, daughter. Little overstatement. I mean, you know, trial and error, you know, margin of error, I suppose. But what's worse is that when the government got their application, for whatever reason, they added $2 million on top of it and cut them a check for roughly $8 million. Took a few months, because, you know, the government does figure things out eventually, usually, sometimes, maybe. It took a few months where they were knocking on their door of their recently purchased $3 million Florida home to start asking some questions. And of course, the family wasn't there. They had hit the road. And so they were pulled over, the 4 of them, in their vehicle with bags of shredded documents, the paper shredder, and, you know, incriminating evidence with them along the road. You know, and, you know, the hard part with that is like, yes, they got caught. As far as I know, they're still living in their $3 million home. But, you know, when you get caught, and of course, it's Christian ministry. Emphasis on the Christian. You know, you look at that and you're like, man, you know, that regardless of what flavor they are or aren't or whatever else, and you put that in that category, it gives all believers everywhere a black eye. You have people that are unscrupulous, you have people that lack integrity, and it hurts everybody. And it's not that you can probably find that story played out maybe dozens of times all across the country. The problem is, it's the Christian part that really gets it, because it's like, you know, the world isn't surprised when someone else, you know, some Joe Bob over there does something like that. Like, yeah, that's despicable, there should be jail time, but there's just something especially disastrous when it's got Christian ministry tied into that. The world holds us to a higher standard. Even those that don't like us, don't want anything to do with us, as soon as they see the word Christian, the next word that comes out when they see that, it says, you're a hypocrite. They're not wrong. Unfortunately, they're not wrong, and it gives the church a black eye. We are called to a higher standard that even the world recognizes that we are called to. We are called to act with integrity, not just before God, but also with men. And that is the message that Paul is sending to the Corinthians this morning. And that there should be safeguards in place to do that, because just knowing that we are accountable to God should be enough, but is never enough. There should be other things that are in part there that help us keep being like honest and forward and acting with integrity and honor among everyone without compromising. And so the message that Paul is getting at us today is this, that make it your aim to be honorable, not just in the sight of God, but also in the sight of men. We need both. We absolutely need both. Now, my outline is a mess this morning because it was supposed to be the whole thing, and it was too long, so I cut it in half. You're welcome. But the other half of that is next week, Lord willing. So there's only one main point, and we'll get to that in a minute. But just so you know that, you're not missing anything at the end. You're like, wait, I see one point. Where's the other one? Because it doesn't exist yet, but it will. All right, but let's read. And we're just going to read the whole passage this morning. But it says this, starting verse 16. But thanks be to God, who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he is going to you of his own accord. With him we are sending the brother, who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. And not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill. And we take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us. For we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. And with them we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So give proof before the churches of your love and our boasting about you to these men. So, have integrity in your deeds. That's our one and only point for this morning. Have integrity in your deeds. So as we get into this passage, I am going to handle this passage a lot differently than normal. I like to go kind of verse by verse by verse by verse by verse, but we're going to vary on that a little bit more than normal, and you'll probably understand why as we go through. But this passage really as a whole is acting as a recommendation letter to the church at Corinth. It was a very normal thing to do where Paul is writing, he's commending, he's recommending these individuals that will be traveling and accompanying this offering from Corinth, arguably all the way to Jerusalem. Maybe there's a pit stop in there. But that's what he's doing. So he's introducing these three guys. We have Titus, we know him. We see him all over the place. We know who he is. But there's two other guys. One is a preacher / evangelist. The other is just some other guy. He's mentioned at the end. He's a man of integrity. He's a man of earnest. He's a fellow believer. But that's about all we know. And people have sought and spent all kinds of time trying to figure out, who are these guys? We don't know. Don't ask. We don't know, right? It's just, he's left them anonymous for a reason. And one commentator kind of put it this way. He says that it just shows that Paul was much more concerned about their character than he was about their names. And that's really what he spends his time on. And that's how we start to understand a little bit more why this section exists. Character, namely integrity, really matters. What we are matters so much more than who we are. We get lost in that in our society because we're all about identity, and that does matter. Identity does matter. But in the eyes of God, the only identity that really matters is, are you a child of God or not? Right? Son of God, daughter of God. When it comes to everything else, when Paul is introducing these guys, part is already clear. And he says, but what are you guys? These are men of integrity. That's what matters. Their character matters. And it's so easy to emphasize all the wrong things in our day and age. And for Paul, he's like, I'm ignoring these people and their names and what they do for a living, all this, but just know they're people of character. That's where our heart and focus really needs to be on. And why are they here? Well, again, we're going back to this offering, which is a huge deal for Paul. It boggles the mind a little bit why Paul is spending so much time on this. So all of chapter 8 and all of chapter 9 is going to be about this offering. Paul's spending a lot. Remember, they're having this offering that's coming for the relief of the poor, the famine that's going on in Jerusalem. He's doing that. We spend a lot of time on generosity. We're kind of done with that aspect of this here now. But when you start talking about generosity, you're often talking about money. And every time you start talking about money, you need to talk about integrity. You have to. You absolutely have to. They come together. And you think about this. How many charities have you ever seen in the news because of a misappropriation of funds? How many businesses have you seen in the news because they didn't use their funds well? How many nonprofits, how many churches have been investigated because they failed to use and exercise integrity when it came to the offerings and things that were coming in? They used them for other things. And I don't know how many times we've seen on the news, there's a charity that's supposed to be, helping the poor in New York City. Next thing you know, you hear, oh, guess what? They've bought a house in Florida. Why? Because it's warm there, for one. But that's not what it's supposed to be for. A lack of integrity. So we have to have this kind of a conversation. That's why Paul is having this conversation right here, right now. It's exactly what we would expect it to be. So, that said, we need to start thinking about the face of God then. And we can spend a lot of time in the weeds in this passage if we want to. We're not. I want to really get to the heart of this passage, which really is verse 21. If you want to, I don't have it behind me. But verse 21, we'll look at it again. For we aim at what is honorable. We have a desire for what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. That is the core, the focus of this entire passage. To be honorable, have integrity in both God's eyes and man's. They both matter. They're both important. You have to have both. And we're going to look at the first one, of course, first in the face of God. That God sees and knows all. Now, I think we all know that. You know, Kids for Truth has been talking about omniscience, that God knows all things, God's omnipresence, God is everywhere, which means he sees everything. Like, I think for the most part, we know that concept. We know that truth. We talk about that all the time. And yet, how quickly we forget that truth. And we act, at least, as if that's not a reality, that that's not true, that we can actually hide things. In fact, our psalm, it wasn't intentional, but Psalm 32 was talking about that. Remember, David tried to cover up his sin. He thought he had fooled himself into thinking he was being successful. And the entire time he knew deep down in his heart, like, God knows exactly what I've done. He knows I'm not fooling him at all. And of course, when the knock came at the door and Nathan the prophet's there, like, you're the guy. He's like, yeah, you got me. He hadn't fooled anybody. Not anybody of consequence, not anybody that mattered. But God can see that. He knows what you're up to, but we quickly forget that. We can also see that in other places in Scripture. In fact, Ezekiel 8:12, it will be behind me. But we see this a vision that Ezekiel is having about what these leaders in Israel are up to and what they think they can get away with. And God, of course, is pretty upset over this whole thing. But Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 12 says this. Then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each in his room of pictures? For they say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. Now, this is probably a vision, but I think this is a vision that Ezekiel has of a reality. It says the dark of these rooms are probably, it's not sure because we're not sure what the temple looked like at this moment in time, but it was probably somewhere in the courtyard, somewhere in the temple complex, that they had carved out these rooms, that they actually had idols and pictures of idols that are hidden down in the temple complex itself, that they were going down in those places, and because there's a roof over their head, they assumed, God can't see me because I can't see him. That's logical, right? And they thought, we can hide this. We could do this in secret because God doesn't see this. God's abandoned us. He's forsaken Israel. Like, now all of a sudden, like, he doesn't know or care what's going on inside the land anymore. It wasn't true. They knew better. And this is the leadership of Israel. Not necessarily the priests, but leadership. And they think they can do whatever they want and get away with it. God's like, no, this is bringing more judgment. And the Reformers had this idea that they called coram Deo. I don't know if you've heard of that or not, but a lot of people have adopted it, but it comes from the Latin translation of Psalm 56:13. But it just means before the face of God. And they wanted to remember that. They wanted to remember that every moment of every day is spent before the face of God. He sees everything. That your entire life is lived in the presence of God, under the authority of God, to the glory of God, as R.C. Sproul would put it. That's before the face of God. It's really a call to integrity. It's a call to remember that God sees me and what I do or what I don't do, even when no one else does. And that's where we convince ourselves of, like, God can't see me because nobody else can see me because I'm secretive, I'm hiding somewhere. I figured out something to do this. And trying to block that out, maybe personally and purposefully and intentionally tried to block something out. Paul says, I want to be blameless before God. God sees. God knows. When you're dealing with money, as really we're dealing with here, it matters. Like, what are you doing with it? How are you raising it? How are you keeping it? How are you spending it? Coram Deo. It's always before the face of God. But we can expand that into other matters too, because we can go into like the workplace. So you happen to arrive late, which happens to everybody, but then you grab your time card and say, yeah, I was supposed to be here 15 minutes ago. I'll just put 8 o'clock when it was supposed to be. I'll write it in by hand, and we put it back. Boss makes too much money anyway. That's usually true, right? It's awful quiet in here this morning. But you need to put that 8 o'clock. The reality is, you think, it's not that big of a deal. That was coram Deo. Or you spend too much time, like you're supposed to be working, you're supposed to be doing something else, and you're just on your phone. You're not really working. You just kind of found a little quiet spot because I just need a break, and you're just scrolling, wasting time on the phone. That's coram Deo. Or, you spend time, you see someone, your wife isn't with you, but you notice someone that's walking over there and you spend a little bit too much time looking over there at her. That's also coram Deo. It's before the face of God. And we forget that sometimes. We forget and think, no, God doesn't see me or God doesn't care. He saw every one of those. Do you have integrity? Are you acting with honor? When I was in college, I had a professor, Sam Horn. Sam Horn. Some of you might, I know Clark does, but Sam Horn. So he was there, and he was just telling us, he was, I think, just trying to get in shape. So he bought a weight bench, working out, and one of the pins was missing that I think held the barbell up across. So you can adjust those for height, for how tall you are, and it was missing. So he went to Walmart, and this is like 20-something years ago, so it's really like almost pre-internet. It wasn't the way it was there. So he actually thought I could buy this here. And he goes up and he gets one from the display and goes up to the clerk in that department there and says, I need this. Not anything big, not anything significant. I says, I just need this. And of course the clerk wasn't able to help him out. It's not like a normally stocked thing. It was something he really could order. But in the process of conversation, he realized the clerk thinks that I brought this pin in from the one I have at home. This is all I need. He's not going to stop me. I can walk out and have what I need. I'm done. That's it. I'm done. I'll have it, right? And for whatever, I don't know if it was lost, it was broken, or whatever happened, why he didn't have it. But he said it was right there, and he was really tempted in that moment to just walk out of the store. And what stopped him? I'm going to guess coram Deo. God's going to know what I'm doing. God's going to know what I'm doing. And, even if Sam Walton never figures it out, because, that weight bench that's on display, it's probably going to sit there for 50 years. Nobody's going to care. It's going to be so stripped for parts by the time they actually get rid of it, because everybody else is going to be doing the exact same thing. Nobody's ever going to notice. Nobody's going to care. It's not hurting anybody. But God already knew what was thinking in his heart. And so because I'm telling you this story, and he shared this story, you already know how it turned out. He didn't do that. But you might be thinking, like, that is such a dumb story. That's a $5 part. Nobody cares. All right, and to be fair, we would have revivals at the Northland once in a while, and people, next thing you know, like students are going to the professors like, I got to confess, I stole a paperclip off your desk, and the professor's like, stop, I don't care, don't waste your time, don't waste my time. And you think it's kind of like a big paperclip. That's really what you're confessing to. Like, it's not a big deal. I'll give you that. It's not really a big deal. But maybe you know this story. I think it was back in 2012 when this happened. You know the Weiler's, I think it's Weiler's gas station in Marshfield? Do you remember that was in the news because there was a lady there who was embezzling funds to the tune of $1.3 million? And she'd worked there for well over a decade, and she said the reason she did what she did was because she had a gambling addiction. You know how that probably started? She'd gone in there one day, she was just short, maybe a little bit, I'm guessing, it doesn't say this, but I'm guessing, something like took a 20, went down to, somewhere or another, gambled it away, maybe even won, took it and put it back. Nobody noticed. Nobody said anything. It worked. Let me do it again. And then she did, and then she probably lost, because the house always wins in the end. But it started out small. And then she was behind. And she probably won once in a while, and she put some stuff back, and got the books back to balance, maybe a little bit closer than what they had been. But over the course of time, you don't walk into Weiler's gas station and take $1.3 million out of the cash register in one fell swoop. It had been over the course of 10 or 12 years that she had done that. It averages $100,000 a year, but I would imagine if you could look at the progression, it was very, very small amounts in the beginning. And then just kind of went on a curve as it went closer to the end, to the point where there's something's going on. It was too obvious to everybody. Somewhere, somebody's stealing from us. And of course they figured it out. But it started out small. It always starts out small. So you might think that pen, that's not a big deal. But you know what? That's where so many people start. And they get away with it. They convince themselves it's not a big deal. I don't have to have integrity. I would never knock over a gas station. I would never steal a TV from Walmart. Maybe that's true today. But when you are not faithful in the little things, do not expect to be faithful in the big things, because it's not how it works. It's not how it works. Paul says, I want you to have integrity. I want you to do everything that you do, coram Deo, before the face of God. Because God sees that. He sees everything you do, and it will certainly change the way you live. So before the face of God, right? I want to have honor and accountability, integrity before the face of God. But he has another one in there too, before the face of man. It's not just God that Paul mentions here. Before the face of man, there's these three guys that we mentioned, Titus, the evangelist preacher, and then this other guy. Why are they there? Why is he addressing them or using them in there? In an ideal world, we should be able to say, like, hey, I have integrity before God. God knows everything. He sees me day in and day out, how I handle myself, and that I'm responsible, that I'm faithful, that I have integrity, that I have honor. That should be enough. And in an ideal world, that's true. We do not live in an ideal world. We live in a very broken, sinful, fallen world. It's not enough. It should be, but it's not enough to think that way. I think we can have integrity simply before God, and you should just believe me, because it's not going to happen. People, even if you do, people are still going to assume the worst at times. And we still need people who can speak into our lives, because we have blind spots. We can convince ourselves sometimes of anything, or just to think, maybe that's not actually wrong, but you're borderline dangerous in what you're trying to accomplish there. Maybe you should think about that. We need people to be able to speak into our lives. Robin Hobb is an author. I don't think a believer, but an author, but she says this: a lock does no more than keep an honest man honest. Have you heard that before? Pastor Loving is the first one I ever heard say something similar to that. But I think she's exactly right. A lock keeps an honest man honest. It's just that little bit of resistance, that little bit of a hurdle to cross over. It says, you know what? I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to violate this. I'm not going to break the lock. And these group of individuals in this passage, I think, are really working as a lock to keep an honest man like Paul, and really themselves, honest. There's accountability there. He wants to be honorable, have integrity, not just in the eyes of God, but also in the eyes of men. He needs both. He wants both. And if you look at verse 19 again, you'll also see something important. Look, here it is. And not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill. He's not talking about Titus there. He's talking about this preacher evangelist person, and what's important to note there is he was appointed to that. Probably what most people think is by the churches of Macedonia. In other words, this isn't one of Paul's cronies. This isn't Paul's best friend growing up. This is someone that's from outside of that. That these others, the circle of churches that is involved in this offering, is like, we know this guy, we support this guy. So they're broadening this group out. So people that are less familiar with each other, less willing to look the other way, are part of this group of accountability. It's not just immediate family. It's not just immediate friends and close friends. It's people from other walks of life, believers, good people, we might say. But they're coming in as being part of this group, ensuring that Paul is not going to line his pockets with the offering that's being collected here. And, we should be just trustworthy. And you should be. But going through life, just knowing that God is going to sees you isn't enough. We do need people to be able to speak into our lives and keep us accountable, keeps us honest. I think, as I said, it keeps us from our own blind spots sometimes. It's amazing what you can convince yourself of. Perhaps one of the greatest and saddest examples of that is Ravi Zacharias himself. He passed away. I think most of you probably know who that is. He passed away in May of 2020. And, I really appreciated Ravi. And some of you, I think, hopefully know who you were. He was kind of unique. He was an apologist. He would go, and in many ways he was fearless. He would stand on the stage like this, but instead of like a friendly crowd like you, he would stand before maybe a mixed crowd, a hostile crowd at times, where you had combinations of like atheists or people from other world religions and people that were just curious, and they would come and he would make his statements and arguments, but then they would come and ask him questions, and he would defend just off the cuff from the faith and why his understanding and view with Christianity was different than yours, and maybe better than yours, more accurate than yours. And what was unique to him was because he was of Indian descent, he understood Hinduism, and it could kind of plug that into that concept and that conversation in a way that, as someone that was near to him, like he really understood that. It was great. Right, and then I appreciated a lot of the resources, and of course he had the whole organization, the RZIM ministries that would go around the world, literally, and do these kinds of conversations and engage people and encourage the faith. It was great. And people in that kind of status, sometimes allegations get floated out there once in a while, and sometimes they're true and sometimes they're false, and he would kind of deal with them a little bit, and they would kind of go away for a little bit. But after he passed away in May of 2020, some allegations started coming up, and they weren't going away. I think in large part because he wasn't there to kind of quell them anymore. And what started coming out was the fact that he really, for all intents and purposes, lived a double life. He hid it from his family, he hid it from his ministry. He went to great lengths to do that. It was well known that Ravi, I guess he had a bad back or something like that. He frequented massage parlors. People knew that, and they didn't hold that against him. He actually owned a few in the southern United States, apparently. But he also frequented several places in other Asian countries where you can imagine the laws and were a little bit different than they are here in this country. And he was involved with a lot of women, and he justified it. He often paid them off with extravagant bribes and permissions and abilities and whatnot, and purportedly even telling some that if you tell anyone, this will ruin my ministry, and you, not me, you will be responsible for millions of souls lost. Oh, who wants to be that person? Others said that they would actually sometimes pray together beforehand to thank God for the opportunity they were about to have. He was so convinced of this that he would even sometimes tell these victims that they were his reward for a life of service to God. You can find more about that if you want to. If you don't believe me, or Christianity Today, February 2021, you can read the article. It's in there. You can read all these details. But what he was doing very, very well and working very hard to do was keeping people out. He had multiple cell phones. He traveled a lot. He refused to go on the Wi-Fi network at his own ministry because he knew if I was on that, then they would be able to see things, track things that I was searching, things that I was looking for, things that were on my devices. He didn't want that, so he stayed off of it. He kept people away, and he justified his behavior before God. And I think it just goes to show, if you tell a lie often enough, long enough, that even you can believe it. He got himself to believe his own lie. He lost his integrity. And he really lost the ministry that really should have been a legacy for him and a testimony, a ministry that would have truly led and really been a bulwark to lead maybe millions of people to Christ over the course of years. And instead what has happened is that so many people they've fled. The ministry itself is in shambles. People have removed themselves from under that umbrella. They've gone off and independent and done things. They've quit and gone to other places, left it in shambles. He ruined it because he lost his integrity. And you think, okay, Pastor, that's great. I mean, not great, but it's awful. But we're talking about money. Now we're way out there. But that's true. We kind of hinted at before, but integrity applies to so much more than just money. George Guthrie summed it up like this in his commentary. Not only in financial situations, but also in areas such as sexuality, leadership, and communication, forethought should be given to safeguarding attitudes, postures, and actions that are noble, morally beautiful before the Lord and before people. We should ask ourselves, with regard to our handling of resources and public witness, do we act with such sterling integrity that we allay suspicion of the motives and promote a positive witness before both a watching world and our God? That's the kind of integrity we need to have, even in doing basic aspects of administration and ministry. Do you have that kind of integrity that is above board? It's a great question. And I think it does apply to so much more than just money. Paul certainly is thinking money and finances here, but it really is much broader than that. That we are to aim to have integrity, both in the eyes of God and in the eyes of men. But do you? Do we? It does matter. We've seen so many people ruin their lives, their careers, their families, their ministries, because they didn't. They didn't have integrity. And they didn't want it. But eventually it always catches up with you. Ask Ravi. Everybody wants to think that they'll be the exception. They'll be able to handle it. They're not really doing it wrong. And then it all comes crashing down. But why should we strive to have integrity? Or, what happens if we've lost it? You might be sitting here like, I've already lost it. I don't have the integrity that I should have or that I want to have. And that could be. But you have to understand, this is in fact why Jesus came. It was actually a loss of integrity, so to speak, that Jesus came. Humanity, human beings, lost our integrity a very long time ago, because there was a time in which we walked the earth and we literally had coram Deo. We literally saw the face of God. In the garden, God would come down. He would walk with them. He would talk with them. They visited him. They could reach out and they could touch him. They literally had the face of God. And then they went off and sinned and did their own thing, and they lost it. And right then, God makes a promise, right? The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. It's the gospel. It was looking forward to Jesus. It was the only thing that could actually restore them. And so they needed that. But even the accountability that they have from outside sources, when Adam and Eve, they sin, they do that. They're together. Oh, that Adam had said, Eve, wait, stop. What are you doing? Let's think about this. And they didn't. They lost integrity before God, and they lost their integrity before each other. They failed each other in that regard. And yet that's one of the sins that Jesus willingly takes upon himself so that you can be forgiven. We're all going to struggle. Like my professor, he walked into that Walmart there to just purchase something. He had no intention of stealing. He had no intention of doing that day. He had money in his pockets. It wasn't that expensive. He was asking all the right questions. And then suddenly it was there, and his integrity was being challenged. Will you act honorably before the face of men and before the face of God? And thankfully the answer to that in that moment was yes. But we can be surprised sometimes when it can just jump out from us. And I never expected to be facing this question, this problem right now. We got ambushed. And thankfully came out the other side. But that's why it should always be our aim to act with integrity in every situation. And when we fail, and we will, just to know that we can be forgiven because of the blood of the cross. Because Jesus died in your place. He made it possible for all of us to have actual integrity, actual honor, to be able to actually say, no, you know what, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this against my God. If you're outside of Christ, understand you just simply have to come. Jesus is a God, a man of integrity. He simply says, come. Come. I will give you rest. My blood, the sacrifice of my life can be put on your account, and you can be forgiven and know what that's like. You can be like David in Psalm 32. You can experience that kind of forgiveness where you are restored, and we can take Jesus at his word because he is in fact a person of integrity. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this moment and this passage that we can look at your word and get a much better understanding of what we're called to do as believers. We've used several illustrations. I'm sure many people in this room can think of many other instances and situations they can think of where people acted with something less than integrity and honor before you and before others. And perhaps if we're honest with ourselves, we're thinking about ourselves in maybe some of those situations as well. We've fallen short in some capacity. Lord, as Paul is trying to assure the Corinthians that he and this group are acting in integrity and honor before God, before men, they were also trying to ensure that that was the case and really use this as a teaching moment for them. And Lord, it's a teaching moment for us. That we do this. That we be believers of integrity, which is not always that easy to do. Sometimes it's hard because what we want is staring us in the face, and the only way we can get it is if we forsake our integrity. Sometimes it's difficult because we weren't planning on something, and it becomes just simply impulsive. But Lord, in you, we can look at those situations and just say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to compromise myself in your eyes. I want to live coram Deo. Or no, I'm not going to compromise myself in the eyes of men. I want to have honor. I want to have integrity. I need both. To live out a testimony before men that they might see our good works and glorify our Father who is in heaven. Lord, may we be in people of integrity for your honor and your glory. In Christ's name, amen.